Hey, welcome. Welcome back to the GPU hierarchy. I've been away for a while, not really away, but I haven't been doing as much as I wanted to, and I'm finally back, made some time, ran a lot of benchmarks. That's mostly what I've been doing, running benchmarks, rerunning benchmarks. Things keep changing because of drivers and game updates, but I am here today with the Gigabyte GeForce RTX 5060 Ti 8 GB card. Yes, that's the 8 GB, not the 16 GB. Why would anyone buy the 8 GB card? Well, because they're stupid or for science. It's for science. So, what I mean by that is I want to show how it runs in modern games compared to the 16 GB card and a bunch of other graphics cards as well. Two fans, and interestingly, an 8-lane slot connector, not a 16-lane width. I mean, all 5060 Ti cards have 8 lanes of connectivity, but most are going to have a 16-lane connector. Single 8-pin power connector, located way at the front of the card though, which is kind of weird. I saw that with the PNY 5060 Ti 16 GB as well. Back of the card, the ports, we've got 3 DisplayPort 2.1b and the HDMI 2.1b, so that's pretty much standard fare. You can do display stream compression on all 4 ports if you wanted to. Means you can do 4K and 240 Hz if you've got such a monitor. Cooling wise, relatively simplistic heatsink here. Does have copper heat pipes and I believe a copper plate as well. And it's got the flow through fan on the rear. The PCB on this is actually super small, which is maybe why they did the 8-lane connector. Like if you made a 16-lane connector width, it would actually be longer than the PCB. Still, I would have liked to have the 16-lane connector because then it latches into the slot. It doesn't really matter for my purposes for testing. It won't change performance, but I think that's just a better solution overall. Again, relatively straightforward card here, but let's go ahead and talk about the benchmarks while I show you the card a little bit more. I've got 15 games that I'm going to be running, and I ran them at 4 resolutions and settings: 1080p medium, 1080p ultra, 1440p ultra, and 4K ultra. This 8 GB card definitely isn't designed for 4K ultra, but there are games that will definitely run okay at those settings, especially on the 16 GB variant. So I want to show what the lack of VRAM does. Same goes for 1440p Ultra. Keep in mind that's 1440p with quality mode upscaling would also be 4K. It would actually use more memory than native 1440p because of upscaling and frame gen and that sort of thing. 1080p Ultra. That would be performance mode upscaling to 4K if you want to look at it that way. 4K would run a little bit slower because of the overhead of upscaling, but generally you'll see similar scaling. All of my testing is going to be done at native resolution. No DLSS, no FSR, no XESS. The reason being, those algorithms are different. XESS and FSR are not the same as DLSS or each other. So it's best to just keep everything apples to apples, and you can view upscaling as a performance mode enhancer, as well as frame generation, another performance mode enhancer. We're going to take these games first with the overall view of performance, that's the geometric mean of all 15 games, and then we'll go through the individual games. I'm not going to try and spend a ton of time on each game, just going to show the charts, no gameplay footage in the background. It takes longer to capture gameplay footage on each card or all that stuff, and it can make for a very bloated video. So let's get to the benchmarks. Overall, 1080p medium, we get almost the same performance as a 16 GB card. That is good. But that's also kind of what you would expect to happen with 8 GB and 16 GB at lower settings. Once we get to the individual games, Quiet Place, The Road Ahead, similar performance between the two cards, almost no difference really. Black Myth Wukong, without ray tracing, full path tracing, slightly slower on the 8 GB card, but basically the same level of performance. And you can see all the other cards too, so pause and look at those if you want. Control Ultimate with ray tracing. Minor drop in performance, nothing big. These are different cards. So I've got Gigabyte 5060 Ti 8GB versus the PNY 5060 Ti 16GB. Cyberpunk 2077, same performance basically, give or take. There's margin of error. Maybe the PNY clock's a little bit higher. It does. That sort of thing. Dragon Age Veilguard, only 3% or so difference between the 16 gig and 8 gig. And this is all as expected. At 1080p medium settings, we should not be running into VRAM limitations. Final Fantasy 16, slightly slower on the 8 gig card, nothing major. Microsoft Flight Simulator, performance is tied as we would normally expect. And we're getting through all of these. There's so many. 15 takes a while. God of War Ragnarok, we have basically the same performance. The 8 gig card actually came out just fractionally ahead. Margin of error. MechWarrior 5 Clans. This one has seen updates recently that improved performance and reduced memory usage. And performance is basically tied, but I had to retest everything. Monster Hunter Wilds, a newer game. And performance is a little bit faster on the 16 gig. Spider-Man 2, this one does often need more VRAM, and we see that here. This is almost a 10% difference. Stalker 2, Heart of Chernobyl, basically the same performance, just a tad slower on the 8 gig Gigabyte card. So all as expected. And all of the other cards are just there for reference mostly. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, ray tracing is required, and the 8 gig is just a little bit slower. Warhammer 40,000, Space Marine 2, basically tied. You can look at the other cards. We're getting above RX 7700 XT performance. And last we have Witchfire. Again, we're basically tied. Great. What happens when we bump up the quality to Ultra? And this is where things get interesting. Look at that gap. We've gone from basically the same performance to now the 16 gig card has a 16% advantage overall. That's pretty significant. Some of that is because one of the games, Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, won't even run on the 8 gig Nvidia cards. Funny enough, it will run on AMD and Intel 8 gig cards. Maybe that's a Vulkan thing, whatever. But now the 5060 Ti 8GB basically ties the 4060 Ti 16GB. Again, running through the individual charts. Quiet Place. Slightly larger drop in performance. Minimums are a bigger step down. Black Myth Wukong, we have nearly the same performance. So this one does not appear to be VRAM limited. Control Ultimate. This is the new Ultra Ray Tracing setting. Still not hitting VRAM limits. Although I will say if you play it for longer, you might run into more problems on the 8 gig card. Cyberpunk 2077, slightly slower on the 8 gig card. And again, longer play sessions, you could start losing a bit of that VRAM access. Just some cruft slips in over time. Same with Dragon Age Veilguard, slightly slower. None of these so far have been huge differences. Final Fantasy 16, another small difference, just slightly slower, 4% slower on average. And Microsoft Flight Simulator, also about 10% slower. That's a slightly larger gap. God of War Ragnarok, we don't see any real difference in performance so far at 1080p Ultra. So if you're only playing at 1080p, you might think, hey, I can be just fine with the 8 gig card and save myself $50. And that's kind of true. MechWarrior 5 Clans bears that out. So many games show that to be true. Monster Hunter Wilds, a little bit more of a difference, like 4% faster on the 16 gig card. And then we've got Spider-Man 2. This one actually shows one of the big jumps. 20% faster almost on the 16 gig card. Stalker 2 still not a big difference, but I will say if you play for a longer period of time, Stalker 2 can start to stutter on the 8 gig card. Not something I saw with the 16 gig. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. Hey, wait, where is my 8 gig card? Well, it just refuses to run on Nvidia's card. It crashes and gives you a message about insufficient VRAM. So we don't even get a result. That's not good. There are probably other games that will do that same thing. Warhammer Space Marine 2, we get tied in performance. And finally, we have Witchfire, which we're again tied in performance. So far, so good. 1080p looks like it's okay. How about 1440p? Now things get a little dicey. The 8 gigabyte card is now running about 20% behind the 16 gig card. And yes, there will be games where there's no difference, and then there will be games where there's a very large difference. I would pay the $50 extra to get the 16 gig card, no questions. I actually bought the 8 gigabyte card just for testing purposes to show this because it's so bad. And I hope you'll like and subscribe to support that sort of research and testing. Nvidia doesn't want to send out cards for review because the 8 gig card's bad. Sounds like the 5060 8 gigabyte card, the non-TI, that they're not even going to let people test it in advance of the embargo. That's how good they think it is. Quiet Place, going through the individual results, we have a 13% lead for the 16 gig card now. That starts to be quite noticeable, especially because we're looking about 10% more money, give or take, maybe a little bit more like 15%. But if it's linear money scaling for the performance scaling, you should spend the money. Black Myth Wukong, this one doesn't show much of a gap, only 5% faster on the 16 gig card. Control Ultimate, ray tracing enabled. Tight performance, right? But I've seen memory issues on the 8 gig card after playing for longer. Cyberpunk, this one dies on the 8 gig card. Now the 16 gig is over 50% faster. Dragon Age The Veilguard, another big gap. You see the 4060 Ti 16 gigabyte is also faster than the 5060 Ti 8 gigabyte, but the 16 gig 5060 is 30% faster. Final Fantasy, basically tied, 5% faster on the 16 gig. Microsoft Flight Simulator is 24% faster on the 16 gig card. That's a big jump. God of War Ragnarok, we're looking at 5% faster, so not really noticeable. And you get that mix. Some games, it doesn't matter. Some games, it matters a lot. MechWarrior 5 Clans. Before the patch, this had a bigger difference, but now it's only 7% faster on the 16 gig card. That will change up 4K, but we'll get there in a minute. Monster Hunter Wild, basically tied on performance. I swear Wilds has like a frame rate cap even with VSync off. Don't like that. Spider-Man 2, 18% faster with the 16 gig card. Pretty big jump. Stalker 2, this is another big one. 32% faster. Very noticeable. I mean, it struggles mightily on the 8 gig cards. Nothing for Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. Again, you can't run it on Nvidia's 8 gig card, even though the 7600 and the B570 run it poorly. They at least try. Warhammer Space Marine 2, basically tied still. And last but not least, we have Witchfire, which we get about the same performance. It's 6% faster on the 16 gig 5060 Ti. So you can definitely play at 1440p on an 8 gig card in a lot of games, but there are exceptions to that generality, and you will get games where you're like, whoa, this totally can't play ultra settings, and you can turn down the settings. Turning it down to high will usually alleviate the VRAM bottleneck, but there is a difference, right? And that's what we're really going to see at 4K with ultra settings. Now, the 16 gigabyte card is about twice as fast. So many cards are just way faster than the 5060 Ti 8GB. 7600 XT, normally quite a bit slower, but because it has 16 gig, it can actually try to run all of the games at 4K, and you're just GPU performance limited rather than VRAM limited. The B580, same story. 4060 Ti 16 gig is significantly faster. Like all these cards that have 12 gigabytes or more VRAM outperformed the 5060 Ti 8GB. And this is probably why Nvidia didn't send cards out to reviewers for testing. They don't want people to show this. And I'm happy to buy the card and show it myself. So let's go through the individual game benchmarks. 34% faster with 16 gig for A Quiet Place. That's one of the smaller differences. Black Myth Wukong, 37% faster with the 16 gig card. Also interesting, you'll see a few games throughout here where the 4060 Ti 8GB does a lot better than the 5060 Ti for whatever reason, drivers. Control Ultimate, 40% faster with 16 gig. Cyberpunk 2077, 113% faster, over twice as fast. None of the cards shown here are really handling 4K, but that's okay. Dragon Age Veilguard, 47% faster with 16 gig. Like, you can't even try on a lot of these cards for 4K, but you can with 16 gig. 18% faster with Final Fantasy 16. That's about the smallest gap I think we'll see. Flight Simulator 2024 chokes hard on the 8 gig card, getting 13 frames per second compared to 29 frames per second. So over twice as fast again. God of War Ragnarok, 21% faster with 16 gig. MechWarrior 5 Clans is almost twice as fast, 95% faster, a huge difference. But that one's interesting because look at the 4060 Ti. It doesn't tank. I tried multiple times and I just could not get the 5060 Ti 8 gig to run well. Restarting, rebooting, whatever. Nothing worked. It was always slow. But on the 4060 Ti 8 gig, it was okay. Interesting. Monster Hunter Wilds, 34% faster with the 5060 Ti 16 gig. Spider-Man 2, 56% faster. Another big jump. Not playable versus playable. Stalker 2, this one kind of laughable how bad the 8 gig cards run. Even the B570 with 10 gig struggled badly at 3.6 frames per second, but the 8 gig cards are all sitting down close to 1 frames per second. It's not that I expect people to play or even try to play at 4K Ultra, but this proves how big of a difference that VRAM makes because you're getting 30 frames per second with the 16 gig card. Almost 30 times faster, 25 times faster, 26 times faster if you want to be really precise. This is why 16 gig is better. Would you pay the extra $50? You should. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, obviously we don't have 8 gig results for Nvidia because it refuses to run. Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine 2, only 13% faster. So a small difference. And Witchfire, which is a pretty undemanding indie game, only 6% faster. So that's as close as it got. All right, let's quickly go through power use. Different cards, so their power use is going to be like not always the same. Ostensibly, they have the same TDP, but you'll see variations here. About 142, 144 for the 8 gigabyte card, while the PNY 16 gig card uses a bit less at 1080p. But at 1440p, it starts using just a little bit more, 5 watts more. That's partly because the 8 gig card isn't able to maximize its performance. The GPU is not working as hard because it's running out of VRAM, and we really see that at 4K where it drops down to 113 watts. Convert that to efficiency. The 5060 Ti does really well. 16 gig card is at the top, 8 gig card in second. Bump up to Ultra though, and the 8 gigabyte card drops to 6th place, while the 16 gig card stays at the top. 1440p, same results. So we're losing efficiency because the card is not able to run to its maximum compute capability. And then at 4K, it really falls off the pace because it's waiting on VRAM and memory thrashing. 9070 actually takes top spot at 4K, interesting enough. Temperatures, these are going to vary by card manufacturer, so mostly we're looking to see if a card stays reasonably cool. The Gigabyte 8GB card does fine. PNY's card runs a little warmer, not too surprising. At 1080p Ultra, still basically similar temps on the Gigabyte. The PNY card gets a little bit hotter. 1440p, you'll see the 16GB card starts pushing higher temperatures because it's still able to max out the GPU use while the 8GB card struggles. And then, of course, at 4K, because the GPU really is waiting on VRAM, temperatures and power dropped off, and so temperature drops to 56. Now, we look at average clock speeds. Notice the 16GB and 8GB cards, just pay attention to where they land. So the 16GB card is running at higher clocks. It's got a higher factory overclock. I think the Gigabyte card is technically factory overclocked, but not by very much. There's only like a 30 megahertz difference though, so it's not that big. And as you go up to higher resolutions and the GPU is waiting, it actually runs at higher clocks, funny enough. So it might actually come out with the highest clocks that we saw on average at 4K, even though it's performing so poorly there. Clock speeds are mostly just for your information. All right, back to the card. What do I think about it? I don't like the X8 connector. I'd really just like the X16 full slot connector. The 8 gigabytes, though, is the real problem. I also don't like the 8-pin connector being shoved all the way toward the front. I get that the PCB is smaller, but you want that further away from the I/O ports. That makes it better for cable routing. So no, I don't like Gigabyte's card design at all, really. It makes me kind of sad that I bought this card. Maybe I'll send it back. There's just no reason to buy an 8 gigabyte card for $450 with tax and shipping and all that. In 2025, spend the extra for the 16 gig card. Or you could just spend more money for a better card overall. Like, even though the 5070 only has 12 gigabytes of VRAM, it's got a 192-bit interface, memory interface, and so it has 50% more memory bandwidth, and that really starts to matter at higher resolutions. It can legitimately handle 1440p and 4K, especially if you want to turn on upscaling. That's it. Let me know what you think. This is kind of a lengthy video, a lot of charts to go through, and I didn't try and put any video clips in there, but I want to see what people think about this. Nvidia did the wrong thing here. They never should have made an 8 gigabyte 5060 Ti. I seriously questioned that on the 4060 Ti as well. 2 years later, things have gotten worse, and 8 gigabyte is just not justifiable. If everything used neural rendering and neural texture compression, that might actually not be less of a problem for an 8 gigabyte card. But nothing uses neural texture compression right now, and therefore all the games out there have to use regular texture compression, and a lot of them are starting to exceed the limits of an 8 gig card. Ideally, I think 5060 Ti and 4060 Ti before it should have been on a 192-bit interface. 5070 should have been on the 256-bit interface. 4070 Super, all of those. The 80 series should have gone to 320-bit interface or wider, and then, the 4090 and the 5090, they're whatever. 512-bit interface on the 5090, 384-bit on the 4090. I think that would have been fine. But Nvidia instead chose to cut costs and cut performance and handicap performance, and anyone who buys these cards is paying for it. They know they're the faster cards. They know that the market prefers Nvidia, and so they're just charging whatever they can, and that kind of sucks. Thanks for watching. Give me a like and a subscribe. Let me know what you'd like to see next, and we will see you next time.